This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 50, U.S. Land Records, Part 3. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of the Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast. I'm here with accredited genealogist Diana Elder. Hi, Diana. How are you?
I'm doing great.
I've heard you've been busy. What have you been working on?
Well, I have been working on my Cox DNA project, and it's been really fun because I've done my first triangulation of a segment and working with DNA Painter to get all of my different segments that I know painted. So kind of had a deep dive on DNA and putting that together with my traditional research this week, and it's been really fun.
Good job. Oh, for our 1-minute case study today, I was going to tell about a new project I'm embarking on. I'm excited. I've talked a lot before in Research Like a Pro about Lucindrilla Keaton. Well, her husband was George Welch, and I'm now going to find out who his father is and who George's parents are. I have a pretty good hunch that George Welch's father is Nicholas Welch. And on Ancestry Through Lines, we have some suggestions that he's the father and a bunch of DNA matches to my mom that all descend supposedly from him. But there's no good documentary evidence documenting the life of Nicholas Welch. So that is going to be my first step to really identify Nicholas Welch. I know he lived in Pendleton, South Carolina in 1800 and 1810, and that's about all I know. I have him on a couple land records with the Keatons and with George Welch. So I know he was in their circle and he seems to be old enough. So he's my hypothesis. And I'm excited to go through and use both DNA evidence and documentary research to identify Nicholas and hopefully prove that he's the father of George.
And the great thing is that you've already done a really big project in Pendleton District. So you already have your locality guide created for that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm really excited because I learned so much about Pendleton, which turned into Anderson County. So I feel like the records that I need to search are just easily within reach. I kind of know what I want to search. I'm probably going to have Dad go and check those same estate files that we got for all the Keatons, and he can go get me the one for the Welches now.
Oh, he'll be so excited to do that. You better think of a good way to pay him.
Well, last time he did it, he figured out that the microfilm set had an index and it wasn't on the catalog. It was tricky figuring out how they were all numbered. So now that he knows how they're organized, it's going to be a piece of cake.
The question is if he can remember it. So hopefully that will all work well, but it is kind of wonky. We'll get it done. I'm excited for you to tackle this. I remember when we first started researching and we had our ancestor Elizabeth Welch connected to a completely different Welch family, and you're the one that discovered that was incorrect and hooked her up to the right family. It's only fitting that you're going to continue going back on this line. I'm excited.
Me too. And I think there's a chance that Nicholas Welch was a Revolutionary War soldier or maybe his father. There's some hints on people's ancestry trees that make it look that way.
Well, that's going to be fun to follow your progress. Well, let's do our listener spotlight. This review is from Alan from Alabama, titled "Confidence to Do This on My Own!" I found Research Like a Pro while searching for a podcast to help me better document my family history. Each episode builds upon the next, but Nicole and Diana present each step in an order that makes perfect sense. I knew that collecting names and noses was not something that I needed to pass down through the generations, and since I'm the only genealogist in my family, proper documentation for future generations is must. The Research Like a Pro free mini-course created the confidence for me to pursue a solid foundation of research for the generations that follow. My work schedule will not allow me to keep up a daily schedule, so I purchased the book, the Kindle edition, and I've now signed up for the Research Like a Pro eCourse, knowing I can do this on my own with confidence. Thank you, Nicole and Diana, for giving that confidence to me. Well, thank you, Alan. That's a great little summary of basically a lot of the things that we offer. We are so glad that it is helping. We love that.
That is nice. I think that's one of the greatest things that I've got from Research Like a Pro too, is that confidence that I'm finding good evidence and documenting it correctly for future generations. So I agree with Alan.
Well, great. So what are we talking about today, Nicole?
Well, today is Land Records Part 3, Land Grants and Patents. And in Part 1, we talked about what might be revealed in a land record, family relationships, clues to past or present residents, associates, migration, and more. And we talked about the difference between state and federal land states. And we talked about the differences in land measurement. Then in Part 2 of Land Records, we talked about deeds and how to find them in the county deed books, both online and at the courthouse. So today we're going to go on and talk more about land grants and patents.
We're kind of stepping back. Last week we talked about what happens when the land has already been put into private hands and the transfer between individuals. Well, this time we're talking about how our ancestors got the land from the government. And there are lots of different ways that this happened. We have ancestors that won the land lottery, ancestors that got a bounty land grant for military service. We have ancestors that used the homestead laws in the 1800s to get land. So many different laws were passed by the federal government and the state governments that appropriated the land. So we're just going to talk about some of that today. If your ancestor was the first person in the chain of land transfer, then he had to receive this land directly from the colony or the state or from the federal government. And then subsequent transactions were taken care of in deeds that were recorded at the county courthouse. So it is possible to trace the land your ancestor owned all the way back to the original owner through the records. But what we're going to dive into today is the process our ancestors had to go through to qualify for a land patent. And this was the first title to the land. The process would be maybe a little bit different depending upon the state and the time frame, but there's some really basic steps that we're going to talk about today. So keep in mind there might be something a little different when you dive into this with your ancestor, but there's some basic steps that I have seen happen over and over in the different areas and time frames.
Let's talk about that. So what is step 1? Like, how does somebody get a land grant? Do they have to just show up and say, I'm ready, or apply, or how does it work?
So yes, they had to do an entry or an application, and this was formal. They had to actually fill something out, and they would estimate the number of acres involved and list any improvements that they'd made on the land. And depending on the time period, the state, the law, there would be different requirements for this. And once all the different requirements were met, then they would date and file the application. And there was a fee that was paid, and they would either pay cash or credit, and then they would get a receipt. So when you look at different records, you will see all sorts of different terminology, and it has to do with the different types of arrangements that they would make. Sometimes you'll see reference to the cash or the credit. So once that entry or application was made, then they would be issued a warrant to survey the land. So why do you suppose they had to survey the land, Nicole?
I'm guessing they needed to figure out how large it was and be able to describe the land for the records.
Yeah, because the individual who made the application would give an estimate of the acres. But, you can just imagine if there wasn't a formal survey made, how maybe you would overestimate how many acres you'd been living on or that you wanted to get a patent for. Not everybody was honest back in the day. And so they would do an official survey, And the warrant would basically give the surveyor authorization to measure out the land and make a record and a formal description of the land. So we talked in our first part about land records, the difference between state and federal land state. So if you're working in a state land state, your description's going to be in those meets and bounds. Meets and bounds where you talk about the large oak tree or the big stone or the bend in the creek. You get those descriptions. And if it's a federal land state, the survey will be done naming the township, range, and section. So you'll have those formal descriptions of the actual land in that survey. And that is step 3, actually. So first you have your entry or application. Second, you have the warrant, which is issued to say, go ahead and survey it. And number 3 is the actual survey.
A question for you. I've always kind of wondered why it's called a warrant. It seems like the word warrant means the government issues something authorizing the police to go in and do a search, right? But this, it seems like the government's authorizing a surveyor to go and survey the land. Is that right?
Yep, that is. And like I say, this is something that doesn't always show up in the paperwork. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but you'll have reference to the actual survey.
Got it.
Like I said, sometimes the paperwork is a little different depending on what was handed down or what the actual government office decided to keep as part of the file. So number 3, then, we have the survey. And the survey is great because this can show bordering properties, including neighbors' names, and we're always trying to collect the neighbors, part of our ancestors, friends, associates, and neighbors. And we also get the natural features, if it's the meets and bounds, the streams, rivers, swamps, man-made objects. And sometimes those give us clues in order to help us differentiate our ancestor from a man of the same name. I've used this over and over again in projects to say, okay, this person is the one who was living next to this road, and he's not the same as the other John Smith who was living next to some creek. When I first started doing genealogy, I would just kind of skip over all that stuff because I didn't realize the importance of really understanding where a person was living and the kind of things you could get out of your land record. Sometimes you get a little drawing, and that's really fun. I have seen, these little sketches about, maybe the bend in the creek and where things are. And I've seen them where it has the neighbors on all the sides. So you never know what you're going to get, which is part of the fun of the hunt, that you might get some real surprising, fun things in these land records. So the survey was usually carried out by an approved surveyor. There usually was somebody in the town or township or county, and that was their job. And then once that was done, it would be officially recorded in the land office if it was the state land state. Or if you're talking federal land states, which is most of your western states, they have the township plat book, and that's where it's recorded. So those federal land states, the land survey was next filed in a tract book, then transferred to the general land office. And they would send in other things with that survey as well. You can have witness statements, affidavits, receipts, proof of citizenship. And that's where it gets kind of fun because you really have no idea all the extra stuff that you might find in that. All of that paperwork makes up the land entry case file. Now, the interesting thing is that many of these land entry case files were rejected for various reasons. And so your ancestor maybe never got the final land patent. But guess what? Those case files still exist, and they have all that great information from the original application. So there's another avenue for research. If we suspect that our ancestor might have applied for land, we certainly could do a search for those case files and look at the original application that was perhaps rejected.
That's interesting. I wonder, is the best place to look for those in the tract book?
Yes, that is a great place to look for those. It's like with any other type of record, we're always hoping that they will eventually get those indexed and digitized and get those more easily available. But just knowing that there's a possibility is really great because we can keep that kind of on our radar to look out for that,
Right.
to figure out if that's a possibility for our ancestor.
Okay, cool. So after the person applies, there's a warrant, there's a survey, they submit all of their witness statements and proof, and it's entered into the land entry case file. What happens next if it's approved?
Well, then they get the patent. And if it was the state land state, then they get the patent, which is the official title to the property. And it was the completion of the land acquisition process. So your ancestor got the patent. That shows that they have title to the property. And if it was a federal land state, then they prepared a final certificate for the patent showing it had been approved. And then they would take that to the general land office and get the official patent. So they'd get a final certificate, and then they'd have to go get the official patent. So federal land states had a little extra step in there. Some patentees also registered the certificate with the local courthouse. And I saw that with my grandfather, Edward Raymond Kelsey, in episode number 2 of Land Records, where we talked about his case study, and it was in the deed books at the courthouse, but it was actually a patent from the state of Idaho, and he had registered it in the regular deed books. So you'll find that too.
Oh, that's good. Another place you could get a clue to where to look next.
Right. So an ancestor who received the land patent was the very first owner of that piece of property. And then after that, when they sold the land, then that transfer of land was in the form of a deed.
Right. So that's kind of what most of us are more familiar with is looking in deeds, the transfer, the piece of property after it's already been patented or granted to the first person. Is there anything else that happens after the patent is issued?
Well, something that you will often see is assignment of property rights. So it was not unusual for a person to start this whole process of applying for land and then assign the rights to land to another person. And this might have been because they were in debt to that person, or perhaps they were getting paid or they're getting goods and services from that person. And this is the exact case with my Thomas B. Royston. He received a land patent and then he assigned it to a John Graves. And there's nothing in the case entry file that tells why. I don't know if he was paying off a debt or if he had received a large sum of money for the land. There's just nothing else in the records to tell me, but I do know that on the patent, he assigned the rights of the land to John Graves. So you will see this. This is one of those common things that you might see in your land records.
I think that also happens sometimes with those bounty land warrants and patents from military service, where somebody receives land because they served in the army or whatever, and then they don't want to move to that state where the land is, so they'll sell it or they'll assign it to somebody else.
Absolutely. That's a great example. I think the bounty land warrants, that happens a lot. So let's do a case study because I think it's always fun to dive in and see what an actual record looks like. And we're going to use the land entry case file for Thomas B. Royston that I mentioned. And this was my very first time of ordering one of these. I was doing my accreditation project and I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to learn more about this record type by actually ordering this from the National Archives. So I knew he had a land patent because I saw that on the Bureau of Land Management website. It's better known as the BLM GLOW website, so General Land Office website. And I had seen he had a land patent. So if you have found your ancestor, anyone listening on that website, and you see he has a land patent, there's a number there, patent number, and maybe you've seen the actual image. Behind that image of that original land patent is a whole case file, and all you need is that number to order it from the National Archives. So that's what I did.
So what did they actually have on the GLO website? They had like an image of the patent only?
Yes, they had only the finished patent. Now they have a little mapping tool so you can see where, in this case it was Alabama, I could see the actual township and the little square of the land. And that's really cool. And you can also see the neighbors. You can see the people who got the patents around your ancestor on the website, but you do not have access to the entire case file. And that's where the good stuff is.
Oh.
So in my case, I hired a researcher who lives back in Washington, D.C., or Maryland, the general area, to go to the National Archives. And I had given her the name and the number for the patent. And then she pulled the records, took beautiful pictures with her camera, and then sent that to me. And so I have these beautiful color images of the original land case entry file that's back at the National Archives now for my ancestor.
Great.
Yeah, it's really, really fun.
So what are some of the main things that you learned from the file that were helpful?
Okay, so what I learned was that Thomas B. Royston had made full payment for the parcel of land, and then I got the land description. And I had already had the land description from the BLM website, but it was confirmation: the southeast quarter of Section 20 and Township 9 of Range 7 in the District of Land subject to sale, Lebanon, Alabama, containing 160 acres and 68 hundredths of an acre. So don't you wonder what 68 hundredths of an acre is? That's so very specific. And I grew up on a farm, so I kind of know what an acre is. And I'm thinking, okay, 68 hundredths. Well, yeah, I'd like to know. That's interesting.
That's like kind of 2/3-ish.
Yeah, so kind of like grandma's garden. So what else did I see in that land case entry file? Well, the thing that was most interesting to me was the witness letter. Our ancestors had to have somebody else say, hey, this guy was living on the land for the amount of time. There was a law that said you had, depending on the year, you had to live upon it. Usually you had to have made improvements, and then you'd have to get your witnesses to write a letter and say that. So the witness letter was by William C. Smith and Isaac D. Wall, and they stated they were well acquainted with Thomas B. Royston and also with the land described. They attested to the fact that said Royston settled on said quarter prior to January 1837, that he erected a dwelling house upon it, in which he had lived and made his home from that time to the year 1840. He was the head of a family, having a wife and children. Okay, so let's just think for a minute. What do we know about our ancestors pre-1850? We don't have them in the census with any of the information of the household aside from the little tick marks, right? And so I had him in 1840 in the census. I do not have him in 1830 in the census. I cannot locate him. I think he's in someone else's household. I do not have a marriage record for him. I've estimated it to be 1834. And the oldest child was born about 1835 from the 1850 censuses on. So this was so helpful to know that he had settled on the land prior to January 1837, and he had a wife and children. This just brought it all together for me that I was really looking at the family in the correct way based on the scanty information I had in the 1840 census. And it was really fun just to have a little bit of more personal touch to this ancestor that lived like almost 200 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
This file only had 2 other images besides that witness letter, and they didn't really reveal a lot. The name and number of the file, and I had the signature of the notary who on the witness letter saying that these people had come in and sworn with an oath, that this was correct. So the letter at the beginning says, we consider William C. Smith and Isaac or I.D. Wall worthy of credit. And then that's signed by a register and a reverend and the notary. So that's kind of interesting that it's like the witnesses had to be actually verified as well. They didn't want our ancestors digging up a couple of shady witnesses to come and say, yeah, he's been living on the land. So they really kind of had to go through a process here to say this is all above board.
Wow.
Even the witnesses had to be verified.
Yeah, and you can start kind of putting together the community that was there. You've got the reverend's name, the notary, the witnesses who were his associates. It's interesting. You can kind of start to see who he was with on a daily basis and in the community too.
Absolutely. And it's like any record. We want to look at every single signature, every single little writing on things, and make sure we understand everything about the record. I wished on this one it actually had a signature for Thomas Beverly Royston, but there is no signature on this one of his actual handwriting. It's all done more in the clerk's, handwriting. So these different patents, they are under certain government acts. And this one was the Preemption Act of 1838. So another layer of the research would be to learn about the law, the act that the land was patented under. And the BLM website does tell you exactly what act it was under. So even without getting the case entry file, you can see what your ancestor had to do to get the land. And that can be another layer of your research, even without ordering the case file.
Now, what about the tract books that we talked about earlier? Did you check to see if Thomas B. Royston was listed there?
Yeah, so the tract books took me a while to figure out. I had heard about the tract books. I didn't really know how to use them, so I had to really do some research to figure that out. And as I talk about all the time, my favorite place to start with learning about stuff like this is the FamilySearch Research Wiki. They have a really good article on there titled Tract Books. And so I went to the wiki to learn how to use them, and I learned that that's where you can find the file number of an application that was declined with no patent issued. So remember, if your ancestor's application was declined, it's not going to show up on that BLM website because they didn't get the final patent, and that website only holds the final patents. And they estimate that about 2 million individuals did not complete the process. That is so many people that didn't complete it. And their land entry case file can still be ordered. So when I figured out how to use the tract books from the Wiki article, they are on FamilySearch. They're digitized. They're not indexed, so you have to learn how to use it. They are organized by the township and the section. So you have to use the description of the land. And when I finally figured out how to do that, then it showed the land description, the one that I already read, and the amount of cash paid. He paid $200.85. The date was 23 May 1842, and it notes that John Graves was the assignee. So it was really interesting on that same page because I like to look at all the other entries around my ancestor's entry, and I saw there were 3 entries there that were declined, not for my ancestor, but for other individuals. So, if you're kind of wondering if your ancestor perhaps has one of those case entry files at the National Archives, you do some detective work and perhaps you can figure out the land description and figure out how to find that.
So you figured out that Thomas B. Royston had a file because of the BLM website. You found him there, and then you got the case. But for somebody else who doesn't find their ancestor on the BLM website, they might not know to check the tract books, which would reveal that there is a case entry file for them.
Right.
So we've got to check those tract books. So, question, if they were living on the land and then they applied for the patent for it, did they have to move if they got rejected?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know what they did with that. I would guess that some of them just kept living on the land. I don't know.
I guess we need to do a little more research on the laws because it probably changed over time. But for Thomas, he had to go and live on the land first and then make improvements to it, and then he could apply, right?
Right. They had to prove that they had done some different things. Usually they had to put up some kind of a house.
Huh.
And usually there's a time frame. They had to have lived there for a certain amount of time. So he was applying, and the witnesses said that he had lived there since 1837, and he had made his home there until 1840. So I am guessing that maybe the law then was 3 years. Sometimes it was 5 years. Sometimes, like with the homestead laws, if they were Civil War veterans, they could knock off some of their time that they had to have lived on the land by virtue of their service in the war. So the government kept changing the laws and the acts so different requirements would apply. And why was the government doing this? Well, they wanted to occupy this land. They wanted people to go out and settle. They were trying to get people to move west and
fulfill the manifest destiny of the United States.
yeah, and some of this land wasn't necessarily great land. Some of it was good, but some of it wasn't that great. And so they had to make it seem desirable. So they would keep making it easier and easier if nobody was going out, I'm guessing. So anyway, lots of things to learn about land. And what we just really hope to give everybody today is just a little taste of what you might be able to find in land and how you could discover that for your own ancestor.
Yeah, if you can't remember everything we talked about today, we'll put a link in the show notes to the blog post that goes over land grants, and it goes through all of these steps that we talked about. So let's just briefly talk about other types of land records. So aside from land patents, there are some other types of land records that we could learn about. Headright grants that were issued in the colonies. There's the state grants, lottery land issued by Georgia, and of course, we have already mentioned a little bit the military bounty land that was awarded by the federal government to veterans. So, if you want to learn about these different types, we recommend, of course, going to the FamilySearch Wiki and going to the article United States Land and Property. I wanted to mention here that I've had some experience with Virginia land grants in the colonial times. The Virginia colony granted land to people who brought people to Virginia. These were called headright grants. They also granted land to people who paid money into the treasury or just made a purchase of land. But you'll see that it's really common in colonial times in Virginia for landholders to pay the passage for several people who wanted to come to the colonies. And then those names would be listed on the land record. And so it's kind of a useful record if you're looking for immigration records of ancestors who came to Virginia, and if you're wanting to look into the land of your ancestor who received that headright grant. The great source that I used was Cavaliers and Pioneers, which is Nell Nugent's abstract of all of these Virginia colony land grants. Some of them are up on Google Books. Actually, I think it was Internet Archive, so that you can search using OCR to find your relative's name in that headright grant. And also, our Family History Center here in Tucson had all of the volumes of the work. And so I was able to go and find the years that I needed and look in the index for all the people that I was looking for. And it not only indexed the names of the people who received the headright grant, but the names of the immigrants who were brought over as headrights. So that's what I was using it for. I was trying to find the immigration of a client's ancestor. So those headright grants in Virginia colony can be very interesting. So check those out. Those are in the 1600s and 1700s. You just never know what kind of records you might find in land records. It's amazing how, because land is such an important part of a person's ownership and the government, there were really great records created. So you just might be surprised by what you can find. What did you find about all of the Roystons? I know you've done a lot of land research for them.
Well, I did do some land lottery research, and I had a really great clue to the father of Thomas Beverly Royston being John Royston, because John Royston, there's a land lottery in 1827 in Georgia, and it's given to the orphan of John Royston. And that just happened to be in the same exact area of where Thomas B. Royston was. And putting that together, it was part of my case of indirect evidence that proved John Royston to be the father of Thomas Beverly Royston. And so the land lottery was really interesting. I had to do a lot of studying to understand that. The Georgia land lotteries, they basically had different requirements for every land lottery, and they did several different lotteries. So if you're a Georgia researcher, you go to the Georgia archives to get information about the lotteries. And you can get the names of people even if they did not get land. If they just entered the lottery, you can get their names. So the thing that I would recommend for everyone listening is working to understand the land in the place your ancestor lived and put that into your locality guide. That's part of the Research Like a Pro process, is to do a locality guide. And we have a section there for land. And I would highly recommend that you do some real study about land. So let's say you're working in New York. You need to understand how land was given out in New York. If you are researching in Arizona, you need to understand how land was given out in Arizona. So put a section of that in your locality guide, because once you do the research and you figure it out, I guarantee when you come back to it, you might forget it. So get it written down, get it recorded there, or at least get a link to a website or a blog post that talks about your specific land. Do a little bit of work understanding the records, and that will help you to understand whatever you might find about your ancestor, and also to help you find the records for your ancestors.
Great advice.
Yeah, so we've touched a tiny little bit on homestead records, but because those are a whole nother topic, we're going to do a whole podcast on that in a few episodes and talk about homestead records. And those are super fun. I've got some really fun case studies to share about those. And if you thought that the case entry file that I shared today was interesting, just wait until I share some of the things that I found in homestead records. And there were a lot of people, up to 2 million individuals applied for homestead land, and you might have an ancestor among those. So we're going to be talking all about that in episodes to come.
All right. Well, that was a great episode today. I learned a lot from you about your research in land patents and grants, and I'm excited to go forward and learn more about the records as I use them. Like I mentioned, most of my land research has been in the state land states. So I need to dive more into these federal land states.
Yeah, it's always fun. I think that's why I like client work so much, because it gets me out of my usual research areas into new places. And that's always really fun to learn about new places, new record sets, different families, different individuals. That's why we love what we do. So hopefully everybody listening today, you can go and see if maybe one of your ancestors got a land patent, and perhaps they were the first person to own a piece of land, and there might be a great record for them.
All right. Well, have a great week, everyone, and we'll talk to you again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.